Thank you. Can you see me over this podium? It is a great pleasure to be standing before you this morning to talk about Abraham Lincoln after having lived these last few weeks through a maelstrom relating to the book on the Fitzgeralds and Kennedys that I completed more than 15 years ago. So I thank you so much for having me today. Let me begin by describing the focus of my Lincoln book, which is growing fatter and fatter each year, so that it will probably be divided into two stories. The first, tentatively titled A Team of Rivals, The Making of Lincoln's White House, which tells the story from Lincoln's surprising nomination over his rivals, particularly Seward, Chase, and Bates, through the election, through the transition, where Edwin Stanton comes into play as the deep throat of the Buchanan cabinet, telling secretly Seward what is going on inside the Buchanan cabinet, through the inauguration, through Seward's famous April 1st memo, where he essentially tells Lincoln he'll take charge of things if Lincoln can't, and finally, through Lincoln's decision to reinforce Fort Sumter against the initial advice of most of his cabinet, the decision that begins the process of Lincoln's mastery of this extraordinarily tumultuous, contentious cabinet that forms the focal point of my second story, tentatively called Abraham Lincoln's White House. Now, through the narrative of events, I have woven a comparative look at both the inner and outer lives of this extraordinary group of figures, combing through their family papers, their diaries, their letters, their official records, and what a great luxury it is that they wrote so often to their families, to their children, that they wrote these long passages at night in their diaries. How they had time to do so after worrying about the Civil War during the day still remains a mystery to me, but I guess life was less distracted in those days. And I'm hoping that this comparative perspective on Lincoln will offer us some insights into a number of vexing issues in the field of Lincoln scholarship, including the impact of loss of a parent at an early age, an experience that Lincoln shared with Chase, with Bates, and with Stanton. Lincoln lost his mother at 9, Chase was only 8 when he lost his father, Bates was 11, Stanton was 13, and while each of their lives was permanently contoured by the early death of their parent, the impact of the loss depended upon each man's temperament and the unique circumstances in their families. The comparative perspective, I'm also hopeful, will allow us comment on the intensity of male friendships during this era, comparative attitudes not only toward anti-slavery, but toward issues of black equality and black codes among these various northern politicians, and the various levels of comprehension or lack thereof regarding the depth of the threat posed by the Southern secession threats and the different patterns of political oratory that each used to express themselves during this period of time. But for today, I would like to play with a very broad comparative question of how the structure of a leader's private life, his family life, affects the course of his public ambition by examining the interaction of family and ambition in the lives of Lincoln and his three main contenders for the presidential nomination, Seward, Chase, and Bates. Narrative historians are inevitably drawn to the private as well as the public lives and include chapters on the families of our subjects, but often the most unanswered question is how does that private life affect the public roles and the actions of the subject being studied? So let me offer some thoughts on that question by a comparative look at the family lives and the nature of ambition in Seward, Chase, Bates, and Lincoln. At one end of the spectrum, way at one end of the spectrum, is Chase, whose driving ambition had no counterpoint in a fulfilling private life. At the other end is Bates, whose happy family life operated time and again as a brake on his political ambition, while Seward and Lincoln are positioned somewhere in between the two extremes, though both lay closer to Chase than to Bates. Let me start with Chase, whose unsleeping ambition led in some ways to extraordinary success, to 2 elections as a senator, 2 terms as governor, Secretary of the Treasury, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His ambition had been part of his makeup since his earliest years. The death of his father when he was only 8, following shortly after his father's failure in business, forced young Chase to exchange the warmth of a comfortable home for a rigid boarding school headed by his brilliant but somewhat tyrannical uncle, Bishop Philander Chase, who bestowed or withdrew approval and affection solely on the basis of successful performance. And that success had to be continually displayed. A punishment otherwise would follow. And yet, even as his uncle's high standards hurt Chase, They spurred within him an extremely large ambition. Even as a fledgling lawyer, he had huge dreams, he confided in his diary, to reach the step where fame's proud temple shone, complete, as he said, with deserved honor, eminent usefulness, and a crown of glory. I love the way these old guys talked. So driving was this ambition that when he was only 28 years old, his religious sister Abigail confessed that she almost trembled for him as she observed his desire to distinguish himself and his devotedness to the principles whose interests terminate in this life. But if his sister hoped that a warm family life would replace ambition with love, her hopes were cruelly rebuffed by the fates that brought him to love and lose 3 wives. His first wife, Catherine Garnis, a warm, outgoing, attractive young woman whom he loved passionately, died from complications of childbirth after only 18 months of marriage at the age of 23. His grief was compounded by guilt, for he was away on a business trip to Philadelphia when she died, having been assured by her doctor that she was on the road to recovery. "Oh, how I accused myself," he said, "that the prospect of a little addition to my reputation could have tempted me away." For months afterwards, believing that the doctors had mishandled the situation, he blamed himself for her death. Then the child upon whom all his affection then centered, named Catherine, in honor of her mother, lived only 5 years, dying of scarlet fever. Losing one's only child, he told a friend, was one of the heaviest calamities which human experience can know. There were so many plans, he said, he had formed with reference to her. He was looking forward to the day when she would run his household and be his counselor and his friend. Perhaps it is strange for him to be thinking about a 5-year-old becoming the runner of his household, but nonetheless, that's what Chase was thinking. But then, fortunately, Chase fell in love again. The young woman, Eliza Smith, was only 20 when she gave birth to a daughter who was named Kate after the 2 dead Catherines. For a few short years, Chase found happiness in a warm marriage, sustained by a deep religious bond. But after the birth and death of a second daughter, Eliza was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which took her life at the age of 25. "I write weeping," Chase admitted to a friend. "I have no wife. My little Kate has no mother, and we are desolate." The following year, Chase married Sarah Bell Ludlow, whose well-to-do father was a leader in Cincinnati society. Bell gave birth to 2 daughters, Nettie and Zoe. Zoe died at 12 months, and 2 years later, her mother followed her into the grave. Though Chase was only 44 years old at the time, he was never to marry again. "What a vale of misery this world is," he cried out. "Death has pursued me incessantly since I was 25 years old. Sometimes I feel as if I could give up, as if I must give up, and then I rise and press on." And rise and press on he did, finding in forward movement and external achievement a satisfaction that no other aspect of his life provided, save his love for his daughters, and especially for his older daughter, Kate, who became a partner in his fierce ambition, even to the point of marrying a rich man who eventually made her life miserable in order to help foster her father's dreams for the presidency. It's interesting, John Hay noted in his diary that on the eve of Kate's dazzling wedding, which took place in the middle of the Civil War, to Sprague, I wonder if he's a relationship of the Sprague here, but anyway, he was a very wealthy Sprague at the time, and they went to a play, John Hay did, with Kate, and Kate cried during the entire play, and John noted in his diary, "I wonder what made poor Kate so sad." Later, I found out that the theme of the play was about a young woman who married for money rather than for love. Sadly, that decision did haunt her the rest of her life, though at the time it was part of this extraordinary bond that she had with her father. Over the years, Chase's powerful ambition encompassed a tangled web of principled belief and personal advantage. After a life-changing incident when he was still in his 20s, when he stood his ground against an organized mob that had broken into the shop where an abolitionist weekly was being printed, he dedicated himself to the black man's cause and became one of the giants of the anti-slavery movement. But as his humanitarian reputation grew, so did his political ambition, as he moved from one party to the other with dizzying speed, seeking the best advantage for himself as well as for his cause, unaware that with each shift he betrayed old associates and forged a new set of enemies. Contemporary observers noted that while he was profoundly versed in man, he was profoundly ignorant of men, that he knew little of human nature. His lack of a warm family life gave him nothing to fall back upon when he suffered political defeats. With little else to ground him, he became obsessed with achieving the highest office in the land, the presidency.